The sound came again last night, a faint tap against the glass, like someone testing if we're still awake. The house sat at the end of Marrow Lane, where the asphalt crumbled into gravel and the trees leaned inward, their branches scratching at the sky. It was a squat, two-story thing, its paint peeling like old skin, the windows cloudy with years of grime. Ellen and Mark had bought it because it was cheap, because they were tired of city rent, and because they thought the quiet would fix things. They were wrong, of course, but they didn't know that yet. Ellen stood at the kitchen sink, washing the same plate she'd washed 3 times already. The water was cold, the faucet dripping in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Outside, the wind hissed through the pines, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. It was late October, and the days were shrinking, the nights stretching long and heavy. She glanced at the window above the sink, her reflection pale and distorted in the glass. Beyond it, the backyard was a void, swallowed by darkness. She didn't like looking out there at night, not anymore. Mark was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. The television droned, some game show with canned laughter that felt too loud for the house. Ellen could hear it through the thin walls, the host's voice grating, the audience clapping like they were paid to care. Mark hadn't said much since dinner, just grunted when she asked if he wanted dessert. They'd been married 6 years, and the silence between them had grown comfortable, like an old coat. But tonight, it felt heavier, like it was waiting for something to break it. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands on a dish towel, the fabric rough against her skin. The plate sat in the rack, gleaming under the fluorescent light. She stared at it, her mind wandering to the list of chores she hadn't finished. Laundry, vacuuming, the leak in the upstairs bathroom. The house was always demanding something, always creaking or dripping or settling in ways that made her jump. It was old, older than the realtor had admitted, and it had a way of reminding them it was here first. Tap. Ellen froze, her hand still clutching the towel. The sound was faint, barely there, like a fingernail brushing against glass. It came from the window above the sink. She turned slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark beyond the pane. Nothing moved out there, just the sway of the pines and the shadows they cast. She waited, her breath shallow, listening for it again. Tap. Her stomach twisted. It was deliberate, that sound, not the wind or a branch. She stepped closer to the window, her reflection looming larger, her eyes wide and searching. The backyard was empty, the grass patchy and littered with fallen leaves. The old shed in the corner stood silent, its door slightly ajar, as it had been since they moved in. She'd told Mark to fix it, but he hadn't gotten around to it. She wished he had. Mark, she called, her voice thinner than she meant it to be. No answer, just the TV, the host shouting about a new car some contestant had won. Ellen's fingers tightened around the towel, twisting it until her knuckles ached. She wanted to look away, to go back to the dishes, but her eyes stayed glued to the window. The darkness seemed thicker now, like it was pressing against the glass, testing it. Tap. This time, she gasped, stepping back so fast she bumped into the counter. The sound was louder, closer, like someone was standing just outside, their breath fogging the pane. She reached for the light switch above the sink, her hand trembling, and flicked it off. The kitchen plunged into darkness, the window now a black mirror. She couldn't see out, but whatever was out there could see in. Mark, she said again, louder, her voice cracking. Footsteps shuffled in the living room, slow and heavy. Mark appeared in the doorway, his beer still in hand, his eyes bleary. What? He said, his tone flat, like she'd interrupted something important. Did you hear that? She asked, pointing at the window. Hear what? He took a sip of his beer, leaning against the doorframe, the tapping, at the window. He frowned, his brows knitting together, probably just the wind or a branch. It wasn't a branch, she said, her voice sharper now. It was, deliberate. Mark sighed, setting his beer on the counter. He walked to the window, his boots scuffing the linoleum, and peered out. Ellen watched him, her heart pounding. He stood there for a long moment, his breath clouding the glass, then shrugged. Nothing out there, he said, just the dark. She didn't believe him. She wanted to, but the sound had been too clear, too intentional. "Maybe we should check," she said, outside. Mark snorted, in the middle of the night. "Come on, Ellen. It's just the house settling." It wasn't the house. She snapped, "Something's out there." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the window. "Fine," he said, "I'll check." He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, the cheap one they'd bought at the hardware store in town. It flickered when he turned it on, the beam weak and yellow. Ellen followed him to the back door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The air was colder now, seeping through the cracks in the doorframe. Mark unlocked the door, the bolts scraping, and stepped outside. The backyard was silent except for the wind. The flashlight beam swept across the grass, catching the edge of the shed, the rusted lawnmower, the pile of firewood they hadn't touched since summer. Ellen stood in the doorway, her breath visible in the cold air, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Mark walked a few steps, then stopped, shining the light at the window where she'd heard the sound. "Nothing," he called back. "Told you." She didn't answer. Her eyes were on the shed, the door still ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. She hadn't noticed it moving before. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shed." He turned, following her gaze. The flashlight beam landed on the shed, illuminating the gap in the door. It was wider now, wide enough for someone to slip through. Mark hesitated, then started toward it, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Ellen wanted to tell him to stop, to come back inside, but her voice caught in her throat. She watched as he reached the shed, the flashlight shaking in his hand. He pushed the door open, the hinges squealing, and shone the light inside. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of his breathing, heavy and uneven. Then he stepped back, fast, like he'd seen something. "What the hell?" he muttered. "What?" Ellen called, her voice shrill. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring into the shed, the flashlight beam trembling. Then he turned and walked back to the house, his face pale, his jaw tight. "Nothing," he said, brushing past her. "Just tools and junk." She grabbed his arm. "Mark, what did you see?" "I said it's nothing," he snapped, pulling away. He locked the door behind him, the bolts sliding home with a thud. "Go to bed, Ellen, it's late." She stood there, staring at the door, her heart still racing. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, listening to Mark's snores, her eyes fixed on the bedroom window. The curtains were drawn, but she could feel the darkness beyond them, heavy and alive. The next morning, the house was quiet again. Ellen made coffee, the machine gurgling as it brewed. Mark was already gone, off to his job at the lumberyard, leaving her alone with the dishes and the laundry and the tapping that wouldn't leave her mind. She avoided the kitchen window, keeping the curtains closed, but she could still feel it, the sense that something was watching, waiting. She spent the day cleaning, scrubbing the floors, until her hands were raw, vacuuming the rugs until the machine overheated. The house felt too big, too empty, the rooms stretching out like a maze. She kept the radio on, some talk show about gardening, but the voices only made the silence louder when they paused. By afternoon, she was exhausted, her body aching, her mind foggy. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the curtains, wondering if she'd imagined the tapping. Then it came again, tap. She stood so fast the chair tipped over, clattering to the floor. The sound was softer this time, almost playful, but it was there. She backed away from the table, her eyes locked on the curtains. She didn't want to look, didn't want to know, but her hand moved on its own, reaching for the fabric. She pulled it aside just an inch and peered out. The backyard was empty. The shed door was closed now, the latch rusted but secure. The grass was still, the pines motionless. Nothing was out there, nothing she could see. She let the curtain fall, her hand shaking. She needed to tell Mark, needed him to believe her, but he wouldn't. He'd say it was the wind again, or her imagination, or the house settling. She didn't know what was worse, that he might be right, or that he might be wrong. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. She didn't go near the window again, didn't go outside. She stayed in the living room, the TV on low, the curtains drawn tight. When Mark came home, he didn't ask about the tapping. He didn't mention the shed. He ate dinner in silence, his eyes on his plate, and went to bed early. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time, insistent. Ellen lay awake, her heart pounding, listening as it moved from the kitchen window to the back door, then to the bedroom window. Tap, 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 like someone circling the house, testing every entry. She didn't wake Mark. She didn't move. She just listened, her eyes wide in the dark, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't. Not until dawn, when the first light crept through the curtains and the house fell silent again. But it wasn't over. She knew it wasn't. Something was out there and it wasn't leaving. Ellen woke to the smell of burnt toast and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The bedroom was dim, the curtains still drawn, the air heavy with the musty scent of old wood. She lay there for a moment, her eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, listening for the tapping. It didn't come. The house was quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. She didn't trust it. She rolled out of bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor. Mark was already gone, his side of the bed unmade, the sheets tangled like he'd been fighting something in his sleep. She didn't remember him leaving, didn't remember the alarm or the creak of the front door. That bothered her. She used to wake at the smallest sound, a car passing on the road, a branch scraping the roof, but now the house swallowed noises, muffled them until they felt like dreams. Downstairs, the kitchen was a mess. The plate she'd washed 3 times the night before sat on the counter, not in the rack where she'd left it. A smear of butter streaked its surface, as if someone had used it and put it back. Mark, she thought, but her stomach twisted. He wasn't that careless. She picked up the plate, her fingers lingering on the cold porcelain, and washed it again. The water was lukewarm, the soap suds clinging to her hands like a second skin. The coffee machine gurgled, spitting out the last of the brew. She poured a cup. The mug chipped at the rim and sat at the kitchen table. The curtains were still closed, the fabric faded and thin. She didn't open them. The backyard was out there, the shed was out there, and she didn't want to see either. Not yet. She sipped her coffee, the bitterness sharp on her tongue, and tried to focus on the day's tasks. Laundry needed folding, the bathroom sink was still leaking, and the living room rug hadn't been vacuumed in days. The routine was comforting, or it used to be. Now it felt like a trap, each chore a thread tying her to the house, keeping her here while something waited outside. The radio sat on the counter, its antenna bent from when Mark had dropped it last month. She turned it on, hoping the noise would fill the silence. A talk show host was droning about winterizing gardens, his voice nasal and overly cheerful. She let it play, the words washing over her as she folded dish towels, their edges frayed from years of use. The task was mindless, repetitive, but her eyes kept darting to the curtains, expecting the tap to come again. It didn't, not then. Instead, she noticed the knife block on the counter. One slot was empty, the chef's knife missing. She frowned, checking the sink, the dishwasher, the drawers. Nothing. She hadn't used it since yesterday, when she'd chopped carrots for dinner. Mark didn't cook, didn't even touch the knives unless she asked him to. She stood there, staring at the empty slot, her pulse quickening. It wasn't like the plate. This felt wrong. She checked the living room next, thinking maybe Mark had taken it for some reason, a project, a whim. The room was dim, the TV off, the remote lying on the couch where he'd left it. The rug was crooked, one corner flipped up like someone had tripped over it. She smoothed it down, her hands shaking slightly, and noticed something else. The coffee table was off-center, just an inch or two, but enough to catch her eye. She pushed it back, the wood scraping against the floor, and tried to remember if it had been like that yesterday. The house felt different today, like it was watching her, waiting for her to notice its secrets. She went upstairs, checking each room, her footsteps loud in the quiet. The bathroom was damp, the sink dripping steadily, the mirror fogged from Mark's shower. The spare bedroom was empty, the bed stripped, the closet door ajar. She didn't look inside, she didn't want to. Back in the kitchen, she tried to focus on the laundry. The washing machine rumbled in the basement, the sound echoing up the stairs. She hated going down there, the steps were narrow, the air damp and sour, but the clothes wouldn't fold themselves. She grabbed the basket, her fingers brushing something cold and sharp. The missing knife. It was tucked between two towels, the blade gleaming under the basement's dim bulb when she pulled it out. Her breath caught. She hadn't put it there. She was sure of it. She held the knife, its weight heavy in her hand, and stared at the towels, expecting them to move, to reveal something. They didn't. She set the knife on the counter, her heart pounding, and backed away. The radio host was still talking, now about pruning roses, his voice a dull hum in her ears. She needed answers. The tapping, the plate, the knife, it was too much to ignore. She thought about the shed, the way Mark had reacted last night, his face pale, his voice sharp. He'd seen something, she was sure of it, but he wouldn't tell her. She didn't want to go out there, didn't want to face the backyard, but the questions were louder than her fear. She grabbed a flashlight, not the cheap one Mark had used, but the heavy one from the garage, and slipped on her boots. The back door creaked as she opened it, the cold air biting her face. The backyard was still, the grass damp from last night's dew, the pines looming like silent judges. The shed stood in the corner, its door closed, the latch rusted but intact. She hesitated, her fingers tight around the flashlight, then started toward it. The gravel crunched under her boots, each step louder than it should have been. The shed grew larger as she approached, its wood warped and splintered, the paint flaking like dead leaves. She reached for the latch, her hand trembling, and pulled the door open. The hinges screamed, the sound cutting through the silence. Inside, it was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rust. She shone the flashlight inside, the beam catching cobwebs and old tools, a shovel, a rake, a box of nails rusted together. Nothing looked out of place, but the shadows seemed to shift, like they were hiding something. She stepped inside, her boots scuffing the dirt floor, and swept the light across the walls. There, near the back, was something new, scratches, faint but deliberate, carved into the wood. They weren't random, not like claw marks from an animal. They were lines, straight and even, like someone had taken a knife and etched them slowly, carefully. Her mouth went dry. She backed out of the shed, the flashlight shaking in her hand, and closed the door. The latch clicked, but it felt flimsy, like it wouldn't hold against anything determined. She hurried back to the house, locking the door behind her, her breath ragged. The scratches weren't there when they'd moved in. She was sure of it. Someone had been in the shed, someone who wasn't her or Mark. She didn't tell Mark when he came home. He was late, his boots muddy, his eyes tired. He didn't ask about her day, didn't notice the knife back in its block or the way she kept glancing at the curtains. They ate dinner in silence, leftover casserole, the edges burnt from reheating. The TV was on again, some reality show about home renovations. The host's voice too loud, too cheerful. Ellen barely heard it. Her mind was on the shed, the scratches, the tapping. That night, the tapping came again. It started at the kitchen window, soft and teasing, then moved to the back door. Tap, 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 like footsteps circling the house, looking for a way in. Ellen lay in bed, her eyes wide, listening as it grew louder, more insistent. Mark slept through it, his snores steady, oblivious. She wanted to shake him, to make him hear it, but she didn't. She was afraid of what he'd say, afraid he'd look at her like she was losing it. The tapping stopped just before dawn, leaving the house silent again. Ellen didn't sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, the cracks seeming deeper now, like they were spreading. She thought about the scratches in the shed, the knife in the laundry, the plate on the counter. The house was trying to tell her something, or maybe it was warning her. She didn't know which was worse. The next day, she went to the library in town. It was a small building, its shelves crammed with dusty books and outdated magazines. The librarian, an older woman with glasses too big for her face, barely looked up when Ellen asked about the house's history. Marrow Lane, she said, her voice flat. Not much to tell, old place, been empty a while before you folks moved in. Ellen pressed her, asking about previous owners, anything strange. The librarian shrugged, handing her a folder of newspaper clippings, most of them yellowed and brittle. Ellen sat at a table, flipping through them. Most were mundane obituaries, land sales, a fire in the 80s that didn't reach the house. But one article caught her eye from 1972. A family had lived there, a couple with a young daughter. They'd left suddenly, no explanation, just packed up and gone. The article mentioned complaints from neighbors, something about noises at night, but it didn't elaborate. She took notes, her handwriting shaky, and asked the librarian for more. There wasn't much else, just a vague reference to the house being troubled in a letter to the editor from years later. Ellen left the library with more questions than answers, the folder tucked under her arm, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. When she got home, the house felt colder, the air stale. She didn't go to the shed again, didn't open the curtains. She spent the day cleaning, scrubbing the same spots over and over, the routine numbing her mind, but the knife was missing again when she checked the block. This time, she found it under the couch, half hidden by a cushion, the blade catching the light like it was mocking her. She didn't tell Mark. She couldn't. He was different now, quieter, his eyes avoiding hers. When he came home that night, he smelled of sawdust and something else, something sharp and metallic. He didn't talk about work, didn't ask about the knife. He just ate, watched TV, and went to bed. The tapping came again that night, louder, closer. It wasn't just the windows anymore. It was the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. Like the house itself was alive, its pulse beating against her. Ellen didn't sleep. She didn't move. She just listened, her heart racing, waiting for whatever was out there to finally come in. Ellen stood at the kitchen counter, stirring oatmeal in a pot that hadn't been cleaned properly, the bottom crusted with yesterday's breakfast. The spoon scraped against the metal, a dull rhythm that matched the drip of the faucet. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that pressed against her ears, heavy and expectant. She hadn't slept, not really, just brief, shallow dozes interrupted by the memory of the tapping. It hadn't come last night, or maybe it had, and she'd mistaken it for her own heartbeat. The curtains were still drawn, the kitchen dim under the fluorescent light that flickered every few minutes. She didn't open them. The backyard was out there, the shed was out there, and the scratches she'd seen in its walls were burned into her mind. She stirred the oatmeal, her wrist aching, her eyes darting to the window despite herself. Nothing moved beyond the curtains, but she felt it, the weight of something watching, waiting. Mark hadn't come home until late last night, his boots leaving muddy streaks on the floor she'd just mopped. He'd smelled of sawdust and that sharp, metallic tang again, like blood or rust. He hadn't spoken, just grunted when she asked about dinner, his eyes avoiding hers. He'd gone straight to the couch, the TV blaring some cop show with gunshots and sirens that made her flinch. She hadn't asked about the shed, hadn't mentioned the knife or the library. She didn't know how to start, didn't know if he'd listen. The oatmeal bubbled, spitting onto the stove. She turned down the heat, her movements slow, mechanical. The routine was all she had left, the only thing keeping her from unraveling. She washed dishes, folded laundry, swept the floors, each task a tether to something normal. But the house fought back. The dishes were never clean enough. The laundry smelled faintly of mildew, and the floors creaked under her feet, like they were mocking her effort. She noticed the cracks in the ceiling again as she carried a basket of clothes upstairs. They were deeper now, wider, spider webbing across the plaster like veins. She stopped, staring up, the basket heavy in her arms. They hadn't been that bad before, had they? She tried to remember, but her mind was foggy, her thoughts slipping like wet soap. The cracks seemed to pulse, just for a moment, as if the house was breathing. She shook her head, blaming the lack of sleep, and went to the bedroom. The bed was unmade again. Mark sighed, a tangle of sheets and blankets. She smoothed them out, her hands lingering on the pillow where his head had been. There was a faint stain on it, dark and irregular, like oil or blood. She touched it, her fingers coming away clean but trembling. She stripped the pillowcase, tossing it into the laundry basket, and tried not to think about it. Downstairs, the radio was on, tuned to the same talk show. The host was discussing lawn care now, his voice gratingly cheerful, oblivious to the world beyond his microphone. Ellen let it play, the noise a thin shield against the silence. She vacuumed the living room, the machine's hum drowning out the host, but not the thoughts circling her mind. The knife, the scratches, the article about the family who'd left. The house was hiding something, and it was getting harder to ignore. She found the knife again, this time in the bathroom, balanced on the edge of the sink. Its blade gleamed under the light, the handle cold when she picked it up. She hadn't used it, hadn't even been in the bathroom since morning. Her heart pounded as she carried it back to the kitchen, sliding it into the block with a shaking hand. The empty slot stared back at her, accusing, like it knew she was missing something. The day dragged on, each hour blending into the next. She scrubbed the counters, reorganized the pantry, dusted the shelves. The tasks were endless, the house demanding more than she could give. She avoided the windows, the doors, anything that led outside. But the house wouldn't let her forget. The cracks in the ceiling were spreading, she was sure of it, reaching down the walls now, faint lines that caught the light at odd angles. She touched one in the hallway, her finger tracing the rough edge. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, like the house had a fever. She went to the basement next, needing to check the washing machine. The stairs creaked under her weight, the air growing colder, damper, as she descended. The bulb flickered, casting shadows that moved when she didn't. The washing machine was silent, the load finished, but the clothes inside were tangled, knotted together like they'd been twisted by hand. She pulled them out, her fingers brushing something sharp. Not the knife this time, but a nail, rusted and bent, caught in the folds of a shirt. She dropped it into her pocket, her skin crawling, and hurried back upstairs. The radio was static now, the host's voice gone, replaced by a low hiss that made her teeth ache. She turned it off, the silence rushing back like a wave. She stood in the kitchen, her eyes on the curtains, her hands clenched at her sides. The tapping hadn't come today, but she felt it, like a promise hanging in the air. She wanted to check the shed again, to see if the scratches had changed, but the thought of going outside made her chest tight. Instead, she went back to the library folder, spreading the clippings across the kitchen table. The article about the family was there, its edges brittle, the ink faded. She read it again, searching for something she'd missed. The family's name was Carter, the parents John and Mary, the daughter Emily. They'd lived in the house for 3 years before leaving, the article vague about why. The complaints, from neighbors mentioned noises, banging, tapping, like someone was trying to get in. Ellen's stomach twisted. She read the letter to the editor next, the one calling the house troubled. It was written by a neighbor, someone named Clara Henshaw, who'd lived across the road. The letter was short, just a few lines about the house being wrong, and the noises keeping her awake. No details, no explanation. Ellen wrote down Clara's name, her hand shaking. The library hadn't had an address, but maybe the town hall would. She needed to know more, needed to understand what the house was doing to her. She tucked the folder away, her eyes darting to the curtains. The light outside was fading, the day slipping into dusk. She didn't want to be here when it got dark. Mark came home later than usual, his face drawn, his hands dirty. He didn't look at her, just kicked off his boots and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The metallic smell was stronger now, clinging to his clothes like a stain. She wanted to ask where he'd been, what he'd been doing, but the words stuck in her throat. He sat on the couch, the TV flickering to life. Some sports game with cheering crowds that felt too loud for the house. "Mark," she said finally, her voice small. "Did you move the knife?" He didn't look at her. "What knife?" "The chef's knife. It was in the bathroom." He snorted, his eyes on the screen. "You're imagining things, Ellen. It's just a knife. She didn't push it. She couldn't." His voice had an edge now, sharp and unfamiliar, like he was warning her to stop. She went back to the kitchen, her hands busy with dishes, her mind racing. The cracks, the nail, the knife, the tapping, it was all connected. She was sure of it. The house was trying to tell her something, or maybe it was trying to keep her quiet. That night, the tapping came back. It wasn't just at the windows or the doors this time. It was inside, in the walls, a faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Tap, 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 like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Ellen lay in bed, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. Mark slept beside her, his snores uneven, his body twitching like he was dreaming of something bad. She listened, her body tense, waiting for the sound to change. It did. The tapping grew sharper, more deliberate, and then she saw it, a mark on the bedroom wall, just above the headboard. A scratch, thin and jagged, like someone had dragged a nail across the plaster. It hadn't been there before, she was sure of it. She reached out, her fingers hovering over it, but didn't touch it. The wall felt alive, warm and pulsing, like it was waiting for her. She didn't wake Mark. She didn't move. She just stared at the scratch, her heart pounding, the tapping echoing in her ears. It didn't stop, not even when the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The house was awake, and it wasn't letting her go. The next morning, she found another scratch, this one on the kitchen doorframe. It was deeper, longer, like someone had pressed harder, wanted her to see it. She touched it, her finger catching on the rough edge, and felt a shiver run through her. The house was changing, or maybe it was showing her what it had always been. She didn't know which was worse. She spent the day cleaning, scrubbing the same spots until her hands were raw. The routine, a lifeline she clung to. But the house fought back. The cracks spread, the scratches multiplied, faint marks appearing on the walls, the floors, even the staircase. The radio stayed silent, the static too much to bear. The knife was missing again, and this time she didn't look for it. She was afraid of where she'd find it. Mark didn't come home until after dark, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. He smelled of that metallic tang, stronger now, mixed with something sour, like sweat or fear. He didn't speak, didn't eat, just went to the shed with a flashlight, the beam shaking as he crossed the yard. Ellen watched from the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter, the curtains parted just enough to see. He stayed out there for an hour, maybe more, the shed door closed, the light flickering through the cracks. When he came back, he locked the door and went to bed without a word. Ellen didn't follow. She sat at the kitchen table, the folder open in front of her, Clara Henshaw's name staring back. The tapping started again, louder now, inside the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Tap, 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 like the house was counting down to something and she was running out of time. Ellen stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup that smelled faintly of scorched onions. The kitchen was dim, the fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped insect. The curtains stayed closed, the fabric heavy with dust, blocking out the backyard and the shed that loomed in her mind. She hadn't gone out there since finding the scratches, hadn't opened the back door. The house was enough to deal with now, its walls whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. The spoon scraped the pot, a rhythm that matched the drip of the faucet, steady and relentless. She hadn't slept in days, not properly, just brief moments of darkness before the tapping pulled her back. It was different now, not just at night, not just outside. It was in the walls, the floors, the ceiling, a pulse that followed her, syncing with her steps, her breaths, her heartbeat. Tap, 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 like the house was watching, waiting for her to break. Mark hadn't spoken since last night, when he'd come back from the shed, his hands dirty, his eyes distant. He'd smelled of that metallic tang again, mixed with something sour, like fear or guilt. He'd locked the back door, checked it twice, and gone to bed without a word. Ellen had stayed up, Sitting at the kitchen table, the library folder open, Clara Henshaw's name staring back like a dare. She hadn't gone to the town hall yet, hadn't found the courage. The house was enough to face. She turned off the stove, the soup bubbling sluggishly, and wiped her hands on a dish towel. The routine was all she had, the only thing keeping her tethered. She washed dishes, swept the floor, folded laundry, each task a weight she carried to keep the fear at bay. But the house was changing. The cracks in the ceiling were deeper, spreading like roots, and the scratches she'd found on the walls, the door frames, the staircase were forming patterns. Faint, jagged lines that looked almost like letters, though she couldn't read them. Not yet. She noticed it first in the living room while vacuuming the rug for the third time that day. The machine's hum was loud, drowning out the radio's static, but not the tapping. It was there, in the walls, a faint echo that matched the vacuum's rhythm. She stopped, her hands shaking, and saw the scratches on the wall behind the TV. They were new, deeper than the others, arranged in a way that made her skin crawl. Not random, not anymore. They curved, looped, like someone was trying to write something or draw something. A shape, maybe, or a word. She didn't want to know. She turned off the vacuum, the silence rushing back, and stepped closer to the wall. The scratches were warm under her fingers, the plaster rough and uneven. She traced one, her breath catching, and felt the tapping again, sharper now in the floor beneath her feet. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped when she stopped, started when she moved, like the house was playing with her, testing her. She backed away, her heart pounding, and tripped over the coffee table. It was off, center again, just an inch, but enough to notice. She pushed it back, her hands trembling, and saw something else. A nail, rusted and bent, tucked under the couch. She didn't pick it up. She didn't want to touch it. She went back to the kitchen, her eyes avoiding the curtains, and checked the knife block. The chef's knife was missing again. She found it in the pantry, balanced on a shelf between cans of soup and a bag of rice. The blade was clean, gleaming, but it felt wrong, like it had been placed there for her to find. She slid it back into the block, her fingers numb, and tried to focus on the soup, the dishes, anything normal. The day dragged on, each task heavier than the last. She scrubbed the counters until her knuckles bled, reorganized the pantry twice, dusted the shelves until the air was thick with it. The radio was static again, the talk show gone, replaced by a low hum that made her head ache. She turned it off, but the tapping was there in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It followed her, a shadow she couldn't shake. She went back to the library folder, spreading the clippings across the table. The article about the Carter family was crumpled now, the ink smudged from her handling. She read it again, her eyes lingering on the line about the noises, the tapping, like someone was trying to get in. But there was something else, a detail she hadn't noticed before, a mention of the daughter, Emily, being troubled before they left. No explanation, just that word, heavy and vague. Ellen's stomach twisted. She wrote it down, her handwriting uneven, and looked at Clara Henshaw's letter again. The neighbor had mentioned the house being wrong, the noises keeping her awake, but there was a line at the end, almost an afterthought. The girl used to sit in the yard, staring at the shed. Ellen closed the folder, her hands shaking. The shed, always the shed. Mark had been out there again last night, longer than before, the flashlight beam flickering through the cracks. She'd watched from the kitchen, her breath fogging the glass, but she hadn't gone out, hadn't asked. She couldn't keep avoiding it. She needed to know what he was doing, what he'd seen. When Mark came home, the sun was gone, the sky a bruise of purple and black. His boots were caked with mud, his hands scratched and raw, the metallic smell stronger now, clinging to his skin. He didn't look at her, just grabbed a beer and headed for the couch. The TV flickered on, a news channel this time, the anchor's voice droning about a storm coming. Ellen stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her heart pounding. "Mark," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk." He didn't turn, his eyes on the screen. About what? The shed, the tapping, the knife. He snorted, taking a sip of his beer. "You're still on that. It's nothing, Ellen, just the house." "It's not nothing," she snapped, stepping closer. "The knife was in the pantry today. The walls are scratched, Mark. Scratched, like someone's carving them. And you're out there every night, in the shed. And you won't tell me why." He turned then, his eyes narrow, his jaw tight. "You're losing it," he said, his voice low, sharp. "It's a house, Ellen, old and creaky, that's all." She shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "I saw the scratches in the shed. You saw something out there, too. That first night, you came back pale, Mark. What was it?" He stood, the beer bottle clinking against the coffee table. "I told you it was nothing. Tools, junk, cobwebs. You're making this into something it's not." "Then why do you keep going out there?" she asked, her voice rising. "Why do you come back smelling like that, with your hands all scratched up? What are you doing?" He stepped closer, too close, his breath hot and sour. "You need to stop," he said, his voice a growl. "You're seeing things, hearing things. It's in your head." "It's not in my head," she shouted, her voice echoing in the quiet house. The tapping started then, sharp and sudden, in the walls behind her. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, her eyes wide, but Mark didn't flinch. He just stared at her, his face unreadable, his hands curled into fists. "You hear that, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell me you hear it." He didn't answer, just turned and grabbed his flashlight from the counter. "I'm checking the shed," he said, his voice flat. "Stay here." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "I'm coming with you." He shook her off, his eyes cold. "Stay here." She didn't listen. She followed him to the back door, her boots on, the heavy flashlight in her hand. The air outside was cold, biting, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth and something else, something sharp and wrong. The shed loomed in the corner, its door ajar again, swaying in the breeze. Mark walked ahead, his flashlight beam shaking, his steps uneven. Ellen stayed close, her heart pounding, the tapping still echoing in her ears, even out here. He pushed the shed door open, the hinges screaming, and shone his light inside. Ellen peered over his shoulder, her flashlight joining his, the beams cutting through the dark. The scratches were still there, deeper now, the lines forming a pattern that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just lines anymore. It was a shape, a rough circle with jagged edges like a mouth or an eye, and in the center, carved deeper, was a single word, Emily. Ellen gasped, stepping back, her flashlight dropping to the ground. Mark didn't move, his beam fixed on the word, his breath ragged. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You see it," she said, her voice shaking. "You see it, Mark. Tell me you see it." He didn't answer, just stepped inside, his boots scuffing the dirt. Ellen grabbed her flashlight and followed, her hands trembling. The air inside was thick, heavy with mildew and something else, something metallic. She swept her light across the walls, the scratches everywhere now, covering every surface, the patterns swirling, overlapping, like a language she couldn't read. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What is this?" He turned, his face pale, his eyes wide. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time she believed him. He was scared too, his hands shaking, his breath uneven. He pointed his flashlight at the floor, where more scratches formed a path, leading to the back corner. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small box, rusted and dented, its lid partially open. Ellen's heart stopped. She didn't want to look, didn't want to know, but Mark was already moving, kneeling in the dirt, his fingers prying at the lid. It opened with a groan, revealing a bundle of cloth, stained and brittle. He unfolded it, his hands shaking, and something fell out, a child's shoe, small and worn, the laces frayed. Ellen backed away, her flashlight beam trembling. That's Emily's," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The girl from the article." Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the shoe, his face ashen, his hands frozen. The tapping started again, louder now, not just in the shed but all around them, in the walls, the ground, the air. Tap, tap, tap. Like a countdown, like a warning. They stumbled back to the house, locking the door, the flashlight beams shaking in their hands. Ellen didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the folder open, the shoe in front of her, its laces curled like dead worms. Mark didn't speak, didn't look at her. He sat on the couch, the TV off, his eyes on the wall where the scratches were spreading, forming patterns that looked more like words, more like a name. The tapping didn't stop. It was in the house now, in every room, every surface, a pulse that matched her fear. Tap, 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 like someone or something was finally ready to come in. Ellen stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing, the sponge worn thin, her hands red and raw. The water was cold, the faucet dripping in time with her heartbeat, a rhythm she couldn't escape. The house was alive now, or maybe it always had been, its walls pulsing with the tapping that never stopped. Tap, tap, tap. It was in the floors, the ceiling, the air, a constant hum that followed her, matched her, like the house was breathing with her or through her. The curtains were closed, the kitchen dim under the flickering fluorescent light. She hadn't opened them in days, hadn't looked at the backyard or the shed since finding the shoe. Emily's shoe. It sat on the kitchen table, its laces curled and brittle, a relic of something she didn't want to understand. The library folder was there too, its clippings scattered, Clara Henshaw's name underlined in shaky ink. Ellen hadn't gone to the town hall, hadn't found Clara. The house wouldn't let her leave, not now. It needed her here. Mark hadn't spoken since the shed, since the word Emily carved into the wood, since the box with the shoe. He'd stayed out of the shed, stayed in the house, but he wasn't the same. His eyes were hollow, his hands scratched and trembling, the metallic smell clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't sleep, not really, just sat on the couch, staring at the TV that played nothing but static now, the screen flickering with shapes that weren't there. Ellen didn't ask what he saw. She was afraid of the answer. She turned off the faucet, the silence heavier than the tapping. The pot gleamed, too clean, but she scrubbed it again, the sponge disintegrating in her hands. The routine was all she had, the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She washed dishes, swept the floor, folded laundry, each task a weight she carried to keep the house at bay, but the house was winning. The cracks in the ceiling were chasms now, splitting the plaster, spreading down the walls like veins. The scratches were everywhere on every surface, forming patterns that weren't just patterns anymore. They were words, names Emily repeated over and over, carved into the wood, the plaster, the linoleum. She noticed it first in the hallway while sweeping the floor for the third time that day. The broom caught on a scratch, deep and jagged, the word Emily etched into the baseboard. It hadn't been there yesterday. She dropped the broom, her hands shaking, and saw more on the staircase, the door frames, the walls. Emily, Emily, Emily. The letters were uneven, carved with something sharp, something angry. The tapping came then, loud and insistent, in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. It matched her breathing, her steps, her fear, like the house was inside her now, or she was inside it. She went to the living room, needing to see Mark, needing to know he was still there. He was on the couch, the TV static hissing, his eyes fixed on the screen. The scratches were on the wall behind him, Emily carved in a spiral, circling the room like a trap. He didn't look at her, didn't move, his hands clenched in his lap, his knuckles white. "Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you see it?" He didn't answer, just stared at the static, his breath uneven. She stepped closer, her eyes on the scratches, and saw something else. A nail, rusted and bent, tucked into the couch cushion beside him. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, but stopped when the tapping changed. It wasn't just in the walls now. It was in the couch, the floor, the air, a rhythm that pulsed with her heartbeat. Tap, 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 like a countdown, like a call. She backed away, her eyes darting to the kitchen. The knife was missing again, the block empty, the slot staring at her like an accusation. She didn't look for it, didn't want to know where it was. She went to the table instead, the shoe still there, its laces curling tighter, like they were alive. The folder was open, the article about the Carter family crumpled and stained. She read it again, her eyes blurring, searching for something, anything to explain this. The line about Emily being troubled stuck with her, the word heavy, final. The letter from Clara Henshaw was next. Its words burned into her mind. The girl used to sit in the yard, staring at the shed. Ellen's hands shook as she closed the folder. Tapping was louder now, faster, a drumbeat that filled the house. She went to the back door, her fingers hovering over the lock, her heart pounding. She didn't want to go out there, didn't want to see the shed, but the house was pushing her, the scratches and the tapping guiding her like a map. She grabbed the heavy flashlight, its weight cold in her hand, and unlocked the door. The air outside was sharp, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth and something sour, like decay. The backyard was dark, the pines swaying, their branches scratching the sky. The shed stood in the corner, its door closed, the latch rusted but holding. The tapping followed her, not just in the house now but in the ground, the air, the trees. Tap, 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 like footsteps, like breathing, like something waiting. She crossed the yard, her boots sinking into the damp grass, the flashlight beam shaking. The shed loomed larger, its wood warped, the scratches visible even from here, covering the walls like a disease. She reached for the latch, her hand trembling, and pulled the door open. The hinges screamed, the sound swallowed by the tapping, louder now, deafening. She shone the flashlight inside, the beam catching the scratches, the patterns, the word Emily carved over and over, filling every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And there, in the center, was Mark. He knelt in the dirt, the knife in his hand, carving into the floor, his movements slow, deliberate. The flashlight beam trembled, catching his face pale, hollow, his eyes wide and unseeing, like he was somewhere else. The metallic smell was overwhelming, mixed with blood, his hands scratched and bleeding, the knife slick with it. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what are you doing?" He didn't answer, didn't look at her. He just kept carving, the knife scraping the wood, the word Emily forming under his hand. The tapping was everywhere now, in the shed, the house, her head, a pulse that shook the air. She stepped closer, her flashlight dropping, the beam spinning across the walls. The scratches were moving, or seemed to, the letters shifting, curling like they were alive. "Mark, stop," she said, louder, grabbing his arm. His skin was cold, too cold, his hand still moving, the knife cutting deeper. She pulled harder, and he turned, his eyes meeting hers, empty and dark, like he wasn't there. The tapping stopped just for a moment, and the silence was worse, heavy and final. "It's her," he said, his voice low, broken. "She's here, in the house, in the walls." Ellen's heart stopped. "Who? Emily?" He nodded, his hand trembling, the knife falling to the dirt. "She's been here the whole time, waiting." Ellen backed away, her flashlight beam shaking, catching the scratches, the word Emily everywhere, pulsing like a heartbeat. The shed felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air thick and suffocating. She grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the door, but he resisted, his eyes on the floor, the knife, the scratches. "We have to go," she said, her voice shrill. "Mark, we have to leave." He didn't move, just stared at the word, his lips moving, whispering something she couldn't hear. The tapping started again, louder, faster, shaking the shed, the ground, her bones. She dragged him out, her hands slipping on his cold skin, and stumbled back to the house. The door slammed behind them, the lock clicking, but it felt useless, like the house didn't need doors to keep them in. Inside, the scratches were everywhere, covering the walls, the floors, the ceiling. Emily carved in loops and spirals, a language of fear. The tapping was deafening, a roar that filled the house, the air, her mind. Ellen dropped the flashlight, her hands shaking, and saw the shoe on the table, its laces moving, curling, like fingers reaching out. The folder was open, the article torn, a new detail scrawled in the margin in handwriting that wasn't hers. "Emily never left," Ellen screamed, her voice lost in the tapping, the house shaking around her. Mark stood in the kitchen, his eyes on the wall, the scratches forming a face now, a girl's face, her eyes hollow, her mouth open. The tapping was her voice, her pulse, her anger, and it wasn't outside anymore. It was here, in the house, in them. Ellen grabbed Mark, pulling him toward the front door, the only door they hadn't used. The scratches followed, spreading across the floor, the walls, the door itself. Emily carved in jagged letters, blocking their way. The tapping was a scream now, a howl that shook the house, the windows rattling, the cracks splitting wider. Ellen pushed against the door, her hands slipping, the wood warm and pulsing like it was alive. "Mark, help me," she shouted, but he didn't move, his eyes on the face in the wall, his lips still whispering. She pushed harder, the door groaning, the scratches deepening, Emily everywhere, in the wood, the air, her mind. The house was closing in, the rooms smaller, the walls tighter, the tapping a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. The door gave way, swinging open, the cold air rushing in. Ellen stumbled out, pulling Mark with her, his body heavy, unresponsive. The yard was dark, the pines silent, the shed a shadow in the corner. The tapping followed, fainter now, but still there in the ground, the air her head. She dragged Mark down the gravel path, past the shed, past the house, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. They reached the road, the asphalt cracked and cold, the house looming behind them. Ellen turned, her eyes on the windows, the curtains still closed, the scratches visible even from here. Emily carved into the glass. The tapping stopped, the silence heavier than ever, and Ellen knew it wasn't over. The house was still there, waiting, its pulse slow and steady, calling them back. They didn't go back. They stayed in town, in a motel with thin walls and a buzzing neon sign. Ellen didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat by the window, listening for the tapping. It didn't come, but she felt it in her bones, her blood, her dreams. Mark didn't speak, didn't look at her, his eyes distant, his hands still scratched and bleeding. The house had let them go, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was still with them, in the scratches, the tapping, the name that wouldn't leave. Ellen found Clara Henshaw's address the next day, a small house on the edge of town. Clara was old, her eyes cloudy, her hands shaking as she poured tea. She didn't want to talk about the house, but Ellen pushed, her voice desperate. Clara sighed, her voice low, and told her, Emily had been troubled, yes, but not in the way people thought. She'd heard the tapping, seen the scratches, talked about someone outside, someone who wanted in. Her parents didn't listen, didn't believe until it was too late. They left, but Emily didn't. Not really. Ellen didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. The house was still there on Marrow Lane, waiting for someone else, someone new. The tapping was quiet now, but it would come again. It always did.